When your world suddenly shatters, the mind doesn't begin with a plan. Long before you can process a threat or choose a reaction, your body has already committed to a response. In 1965, Admiral James Stockdale was an elite pilot operating from the flight deck of the USS Oriskany. He was the picture of military readiness, highly trained, disciplined, and in total control of his environment. That control vanished over North Vietnam. After being shot down and captured, Stockdale was taken to the Hoa Lo prison, the Hanoi Hilton. For the next 8 years, he would face solitary confinement, systemic torture, and a total lack of medical care. If we freeze the story at the moment those heavy cell doors closed, we can see the start of a different war. This one wasn't fought with steel, but within the microscopic architecture of his own brain. Under extreme pressure, physical stamina only goes so far. The real variable of survival is found in the microscopic window of time between a shock to the system and our first coherent thought. This timeline tracks the brain's immediate response to a threat. At 40 milliseconds, faster than a blink, the amygdala ignites. This is the brain's raw alarm system firing without your permission and flooding the body with stress hormones. Ancient Stoic philosophers intuited this reflex 2,000 years ago. They called it the propathe, the involuntary first movement of emotion that exists before conscious judgment can intervene. In a traumatic environment, the signal often fails to move forward. Instead, it traps itself in a repeating circuit called the default mode network. The brain locks into a loop of rumination and panic, replaying the threat over and over. This loop fuels what psychologists call the tyranny of the shoulds. These are rigid internal demands, the desperate insistence that the situation must be different or the pain shouldn't be happening. Remaining trapped in this 40 millisecond reflex keeps the system flooded with stress hormones. Over years of captivity, this internal siege exhausts the body's metabolic resources and degrades the very neural networks needed to maintain sanity. There is a terrifying cognitive void between that 40 millisecond alarm and the arrival of logic. In this space, the amygdala is screaming danger, but the reasoning centers of the brain are still completely offline. Inside the Hanoi Hilton, this gap became a filter for survival. Stockdale noticed a grim pattern. The prisoners who died of broken hearts, who simply lost the will to live, were often the optimists. These men relied on a brittle form of positivity. They believed they would be home by Thanksgiving. When Thanksgiving passed, they hoped for Christmas. When the holidays came and went without rescue, the gap between their expectations and the brutal reality eventually crushed them. Stockdale survived by balancing two opposing truths. He never lost faith that he would eventually prevail, but he simultaneously maintained the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of his current reality. Hope that isn't grounded in a dark realism becomes a psychological vulnerability. Without that anchor, the mind eventually fractures when relief fails to arrive. At 280 milliseconds, the prefrontal cortex boots up. Logic comes online to stabilize the system. The Stoics called this second wave the pathe, the space of choice. Here, a raw biological reflex is analyzed, judged, and transformed into a chosen response. This ancient insight formed the foundation of rational emotive behavior therapy, developed by Albert Ellis.
Ellis realized that human beings are not disturbed by things themselves, but by the irrational views they take of those things. Ellis taught his patients the art of cognitive distancing, ruthlessly disputing their own panicked beliefs. By logically tearing apart their irrational demands, they could neutralize the amygdala's alarm and reclaim their executive focus. This 280 millisecond intervention is the dividing line. It is the boundary between a mind that breaks under pressure and one that survives it. When the gears of time finally resume, resilience reveals its physical form, a widening gap between a stimulus and your reaction. This gap is a result of neuroplasticity. Every time you consciously catch yourself in that millisecond pause, you are physically rewiring your brain's response to stress. By repeatedly practicing rational dispute and unconditional self-acceptance, you are myelinating the neural pathways of the prefrontal cortex. You are making the path to logic faster and more durable than the path to panic. This process creates stress inoculation.
It protects the brain's dopamine levels and prevents the executive center from being permanently hijacked by the trauma reflex. It is the biological blueprint for how Admiral Stockdale walked out of the Hanoi Hilton with his dignity intact. You cannot stop the darkness from ambushing your brain at 40 milliseconds. The alarm will always sound, but the defense of your sanity is forged entirely in the gap that follows.